It's really about the total amount of protein you're going to get in the day. And then the next one would be, even spacing, and I'd say, yeah. And then the next one would be sort of protein quality, where, we get into some of the more nuanced talk about protein. And then you can dial it down from there. Most people I talk to, I just say, do you go to the gym? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, how many times? They're like, well, once or twice. I said, maybe you could go 2 or 3 times. That would probably be a much bigger benefit than I need to divide my protein 3 times across the day. So biggest reduction in risk, bar none, is always going from nothing to doing something.
Hi everyone, I'm very honored to be sitting here today with our podcast guest, Dr. Stuart Phillips. Dr. Phillips is the director of the Physical Activity Center of Excellence at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada. As we are going to learn today, his research and his lab has made pretty big contributions to our understanding of muscle protein synthesis. And I'm pretty excited to dive into all that research. I've spent the last week reading review articles and studies. Yes. Yeah. So, now I feel like I've just learned a tremendous amount compared to, what I knew last week. So, it's just
excellent.
Maybe we can just start off talking about muscle mass and why, we hear a lot, oftentimes physicians, almost everyone knows about body mass and body fat percentages and BMIs and what's a healthy BMI and what's not. Yeah. And, but, muscle mass is also important. So maybe we can talk about why.
Sure. Yeah, I think when you step on a scale, everybody at least should realize that the sum of all of your body, so we say compartments, is what you see on the scale. And most people can appreciate, obviously they're worried about their body fat content, but a large part of what's registering on the scale is actually what we call lean mass, or some of it is muscle mass, and then obviously your bone mass as well. So I think most people will probably understand we're about almost 70% by content water, and most of that water is inside our cells, and a lot of it is inside muscle mass. So what we call muscle mass or lean mass is very hydrated tissue. Fat mass is actually not, and its preservation, muscle mass at least as we get older, is critical for health. I think it's one of the things that's lost on a lot of people to say, well, that's great that you're maintaining your body weight, but if we don't maintain our muscle mass, it has some pretty deleterious consequences.
And muscle mass correlates, specifically with mortality, right? There's an inverse correlation.
Absolutely. I think that the outward manifestation of muscle mass is obviously, our ability to move around, strength, getting up out of a chair, that sort of thing. And at some stage in our life, you're going to have to be able to do these sort of rudimentary activities of daily living. And once you can't do them, then, you need somebody to care for you. So it's not surprising that there are, as you say, correlations between muscle mass and mortality. It's a vitally important organ if you look at it that way.
I think the frailty index, which is, there's a lot of measures that go into that, frailty indexes, as you get older, at least over 65, it's a pretty good predictor of mortality. Yeah. And muscle mass is an important component of that. Am I right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think all of these definitions, you say frailty, the precursor would be sarcopenia, or loss of muscle mass as we age, all have a component of measuring lean mass or muscle mass, and it's predictive of a downward decline as we get older, for sure.
I've seen some studies that have also correlated specifically lower body, I think strength of lower body with improved cognition. And I was wondering, just for me, I don't like, why not upper body? Why lower body? Like, do you think is there a, potential, like, people that are also doing cardio or getting some lower body strength, or do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer the question, but it's interesting to note, some of these correlations come up, and when it's a correlation, obviously it's association, and people want to know, is it causative, right? And so you always kind of hedge your bets, and what I say to people, I said, I don't know, but it's not a bad goal to aim for, to have stronger legs and be able to move around. And if it correlates with, improved cognition and mental function as you age, if that's a connection between the two, it's not a bad goal to aim for. Whether one causes the other, I can't say. But, Yeah, I'll take it if it's a causative relationship for sure.
What percent of muscle mass do humans lose like per year, and when does that start? Like you mentioned sarcopenia.
Yeah, this is the, I would say $64,000, although that wouldn't get you much these days, probably more question, I suppose. Most people will say that somewhere in your 30s or 40s, you're beginning to lose muscle mass. My own personal opinion is it's somewhere probably closer to about 56 or thereabouts, but that's personal. But something, probably for most people that you can see in their 40s. And usually what we say on a population level, it's about a 1% loss of muscle mass per year and about a 1 to 3% drop in strength or power. So the muscle mass decline is actually slower than we lose strength. And strength, is, as I say, is the outward manifestation of muscle, but it must speak then to the quality of the muscle you have and your brain's ability to be able to talk to muscle and get you to do things. So as much as we can do to try and slow that would be beneficial as we get into our older age, for sure.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get into all that stuff, how we can counter sarcopenia and loss of muscle mass. Do you, the building up of the muscle reserves, now like
Right.
That's something I've heard you talk about, or,
Yep.
it's something that's a common knowledge to some degree.
Yep.
What does that mean? And is it, really important to do that before a certain age? And if you don't do that, can you still start later in life?
Yeah, great question. I think the parallel that most people are most familiar with, that we can sort of pick on and say, women in particular are told that we can build bone mass up until probably about 30. Men, it's about the same. That when women head towards the menopausal transition, that they're definitely going to lose bone mass. You want to start at a higher level as possible. Everybody after the menopausal transition loses bone at about the same rate. So you really would like to be on a higher plateau before you get there. I think the concept is entirely similar with muscle. The good news is that probably even past your 30s into your 40s, 60s, probably even into your 70s, we can still gain a little bit of muscle. We can definitely gain strength by concerted, resistance exercise usually. So you probably have a much bigger window to accumulate the muscle that you have, but it's the same concept. You'd like to go into older age when you're beginning to lose muscle at a higher level, because then you're starting to decline from a higher plateau. So it's a similar concept. I don't know that we know exactly how much and when, but there are even studies in nonagenarians, people in their 90s lifting weights, and they can get stronger. Now gaining muscle, not so much, but they get function back. So there's some adaptability left in the system in a muscle sense that isn't there with bones, for example.
And at the end of the day, as you're mentioning, being able to get up out of your chair and like these sorts of important little everyday activities that we take for granted when we're younger can make a difference when you're older and you fall and break a hip, and then you kind of go into this downward spiral. So strength does make a difference with that, right? Just having, even if you're not gaining muscle mass, being able to have the strength to do that.
Absolutely. I think that's maybe a little bit overstated with the importance of muscle mass. Not that it's not important, but the function and the outcome, so the strength and the power is really the key point. Even something as simple as walking speed, or what we call normal gait speed. And the example I like to give is to say, you're standing at an intersection, the walk signal comes on, and there's a certain distance you've got to cross in a certain amount of time, so you need a certain gait speed. And if not that the motorist hopefully wouldn't stop, but you're under pressure to make it across an intersection, let's say. It's important, and we know fully that once you get to a certain level of strength, your gait speed drops. It becomes more difficult to do activities of daily living, and then you're looking at full-time institutionalized care.
Right, quality of life going down, and it kind of goes back to that concept of improving health span, right?
Yeah.
Basically, being able to delay the onset of these age-related diseases
Yeah.
and diseases that hit us later in life,
Yeah.
any possible way that we can,
Absolutely.
even if we don't necessarily live much, much longer. But
Yeah.
in some cases, delaying those diseases, you might get a year or two, right? I mean,
Yeah, I think it's not trite to say, but everybody said, well, what's exercise going to give you? And we do have, and again, it's observational data, of course, that once you hit that sort of 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous, whichever, okay, that's the guidelines. And I think you maintain your strength, and so make sure you do those 2 days of strengthening exercises a week. We get on average, when you look at population data, about 4 extra years of life. So I think most people would take that. If that were a pill, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be Skyping in from Tahiti or something. And most people obviously realize then that your health span that's associated with that is longer as well. So it's time in your life that's longer, but it's time in your life that is spent in good health. And for most people, that's a better quality of life.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some of the major signals and inputs that regulate muscle protein synthesis,
Sure.
which
Yeah.
I guess we can talk about how much that correlates with muscle mass
Yeah.
and strength.
Yeah.
So you've published, or let's first talk about recommended daily allowances for
Sure.
protein intake
Sure.
for adults
Yep.
in the United States and
Yep.
Canada. It's about 0.8 grams of protein
Yep.
per kilogram body weight.
Correct.
And
Yep.
I don't know what people are actually consuming. Maybe you can
Yeah.
shed some light onto that, what they're actually consuming.
Yeah.
But also I know you have thoughts because you've published them
Sure.
on whether or not it's scientifically sound,
Yeah.
that number specifically.
Yeah. So, one of the things, the precursor I like to start off with is to say, people say, how is protein different than everything else that we eat, and what does it do? And so I often explain to people that carbohydrates and fats, that's fuel. You put that in and you burn it, or we store it. And unfortunately, we're really good at doing that. But protein is something that when you ingest it, your body has to use it. And there's not like a little sort of place that you can store away the building blocks of protein, which are amino acids, and kind of use them for later. Although your muscle is sort of a reservoir of that. So it does turn over a little bit. And then so when we think about it from a daily recommended intake, or what we call the recommended dietary allowance, it's the amount of protein that you need to ingest to replace all of the protein and amino acids that your body loses. And most of it is lost in urine as urea. And I say to people I've stopped trying to fight too much against this, because I would actually be happy if they just changed the name from recommended dietary allowance to minimal dietary intake. So first, I don't think it should be recommended because it's too low. And I think you should be allowed to eat more. So 0.8, I think, is, to me, that's the sort of bottom level buy-in. That's where you need to start and then build up from there. So most of the data that we have, and it's not ours, there's lots of other people who have contributed to this as well, suggests that a minimum might be closer to about 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. And athletes and even older people could probably benefit even from going up from that level up to about 1.6. At a certain point, I don't think you can put too much protein back into the system and the system would hang on to it. So every species has evolved a way of getting rid of extra protein. Fish, it's ammonia. Birds, it's uric acid. Mammals, it's urea. So there's an upper limit. But most people, depending on what surveys you look at, when they're younger and even middle-aged, are probably doing okay in terms of protein. So I'll put hand on heart and say probably not a big issue. When you get a little older, people's appetite goes down. People tend to gravitate towards different ways of eating, and protein actually becomes a much smaller percentage of their diet. So at the time when I think you need more protein and you want to support muscle mass and lean mass as you age, most people's protein intake is actually going down to levels where it becomes limiting to the amount of muscle that they can hang on to. So that, I think, is an important sort of distinction between let's aim at the minimum and let's go into what we call a more optimal protein intake range. And I don't know where and at what age that begins, but I think it's an important consideration as most of us myself included, transitioned towards, I'm looking at the rest of my life and thinking, I want to be in as best health as I can. And so I have to be a little bit more cognizant about the protein that I eat.
What went into your determining 1.2 grams per kilogram body weight? So you're saying most young adults are consuming that probably, and then also like, I guess, talking about the audience, like, are we talking about like to people that are in a big caloric excess? Well, they're probably already getting that protein, right? I mean, like if they're in a huge excess of, eating more calories, they're probably getting more protein and everything else.
Absolutely.
But, so like, is it relevant for, every age, or maybe people that are really physically active, like you said, go up a little more? So why 1.2? What was the science behind that?
Yeah, so the original studies that led to the derivation of the recommended dietary allowance are what we call nitrogen balance. And as the name implies, it's measuring all the nitrogen or protein that goes into our body and collecting everything that comes out. So wonderful, delightful studies to do. Those studies we've known for a long time are problematic because of incomplete collection, overestimation, et cetera, of losses. So one of the things that we do know is that the closer you get to your requirement, your body actually gets much more efficient at utilizing protein. So, and that's not really taken into account in the way people have modeled that data. So without, going too deep into the weeds, let's just say that there are alternative approaches using stable isotopes that have consistently shown that people actually need, when I say need, to maintain the balance that we talk about, higher intakes. And so that's the 1.2. So it's not that, 0.8 really, does it for a lot of people. We need to come up to 1.2. And then from 1.2 and above, we're talking about optimal intakes. And I think the example, the one that people can maybe relate to a little bit, is that up until probably about 25 years ago, we aimed at a vitamin C intake that prevented scurvy. And that was good, because who wants scurvy, right? But then we've done some science, and not me, but obviously lots of other people, to show that intakes above the vitamin C intake that prevented scurvy were actually associated with health benefits. And so we make that recommendation. We haven't done that for protein. We're still aiming at the prevention of deficiency as opposed to the optimization of processes that are important. And there's still a lot of people that push back against my viewpoints, and I'll take the heat. I think what hasn't been considered is this maintenance of muscle and mobility as we age, that is in part driven by protein intake. I mean, the other half is we can't get away without talking about exercise, right? So that's the other side of the equation.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the protein intake, and you're talking about people getting pushback. There definitely are animal studies that have looked at, caloric restriction and protein restriction and its effect on how lab rodents live and how healthy they live. And I think that, as you and I have talked off camera, there's a lot of different types of people that are in different life stages. We've got obese people, like sedentary, that could probably benefit from caloric restriction. We've got young, healthy, physically active people that are probably needing more protein intake. We've got the older people that are battling sarcopenia that probably need more protein intake. And then we have the whole fasting community.
Sure.
So, I mean, it's like, I've had a lot of fasting experts on the podcast, as you know, and I think what a better job that needs to be done is basically just talking about the audience, talking about, okay, who are we speaking to here with this specific thing we're talking about, because it's important. There's different people in different stages of life. And then I think also with some of the protein restriction as well, it very similar. And I've listened to some of the things that you've talked about with, extrapolating data from lab animals, specifically on caloric restriction and dietary restriction, protein restriction to humans, may be a little murky because of something called this disuse and disease that humans are just so susceptible to. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because it makes so much sense.
Yeah, I mean, the writer's statement, I think, and the disclaimer right at the start is to say, tremendous amount of respect for the science of the people that do the studies around caloric restriction, protein restriction, et cetera. Most of it is done, as you mentioned, in lab animals, mostly small rodents, so usually mice or rats sometimes. And I think one of the things that's important to point out is when we've compared primates head to head, so this is in caloric restriction, arguably the most robust model of survival, extending lifespan, the data is actually conflicting. It's only been done, obviously, in 2 different locations. And so if you were a primate, in one location, you did better than primates in the other, but the net result was it actually didn't extend lifespan. So that sort of makes you think, okay, maybe it's not as clear-cut as you might think. Obviously, small rodents, they're mammals, so the extrapolation to us is often done. Drug companies do it all the time, I understand. I think the thing that I focus on the most is around, there's a caged animal that lives in a very controlled environment, and food is, there is no fluctuation in food. It's sort of held at here or here because it's given or taken away from the animal. So choice is taken away from the animal that human beings are notoriously, sometimes great, sometimes not so much at making. And these animals aren't exposed to a lot of the same stressors. So one of the concepts that we, and it was something in reading, a good friend of mine, Doug Padden-Jones, who sadly passed away really early in his life, pointed out at these catabolic crises that we have. And for him, it meant a period of hospitalization. And during this event, the de facto treatment in hospital is you go into bed rest. And we've known for years that putting people in bed rest, and you can ask any clinician, it's a bad situation. You're not using your muscles, you become instantly sedentary, obviously. And it would exacerbate a lot of other issues if you went into bed rest with type 2 diabetes, you were overweight, et cetera, et cetera. So these events, you can appreciate bed rest and a catabolic crisis if you've got a hospital event that's going to be bad. I get that. So we sort of said, well, dial it back a little bit. Maybe you get flu and you're an older person, you get some respiratory distress, you go into hospital for a few days, you're on oxygen, but now you're fine to be released from the hospital, but you go home and convalesce for 2 weeks. So this is a disuse event, relatively speaking, but you're okay, but you sit around for 2 weeks. And we think as you get older, even those types of events are a disuse event that we think precipitates an issue. And I was fond of saying that, well, this happens every year it happens everywhere because people get the flu. And I said, but there's maybe a uniquely, if not Canadian, but northern US phenomenon that when it's freezing cold outside, you also, as an older person, you don't go outside. You don't want to shovel your snow. You could slip, so. And clinicians would say, yeah, but how often does that happen? Then COVID comes along, and I said, happens a lot. So I feel a little bit of vindication. I said, this is a relevant model. And what happens is if you can imagine they're already going down because sarcopenia is happening. When they have a disuse event, they bend the curve dramatically. So there's an accelerated rate of muscle loss. And what happens, when you're younger, you go down, but you're able to bounce back up. At some point, and this is universally, I think, understood by clinicians, is that an older person that has that event like that is actually now on a different downward trajectory. So they've actually hopped, they've accelerated the loss that they have with aging to a fairly large degree. The best, way to explain it to people is to say you put somebody up in space because there's no gravity. That's effectively disuse because you can't really generate any force with your muscles. And we know that, 6 months or a year spending up at the space station is about 10 to 15 years of skeletal and muscle aging. And it's tough to get back. In fact, most of those astronauts, I'd be willing to bet, don't get much of that back when they come even down to Earth. So that's the price you pay for a little bit of weightlessness for about 6 months to a year.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible about the astronauts. But just speaking to like what you were saying with the disuse and disease, again, it makes a lot of sense because laboratory rodents are not really exposed to that. They're in these little sterile environments that are, So, I think, again, at the end of the day, just to kind of get this, I think, to make it clear to people listening here today, I still do think there are benefits to different types of intermittent fasting for different people. And whether we're talking about someone that's obese and overweight, having a form of caloric deficit, which can be achieved a lot of ways, including probably the best. I mean, like exercise. Exercise is probably the cornerstone of health span, right?
Sure,
I mean, like that's
absolutely.
I think we agree there. But also like there's different types of fasting. There's the constant caloric restriction, like we were just talking about. But there's also just not eating 2 to 3 hours before bed.
Sure.
And that's something I think most people can benefit from, honestly, because you're not as insulin sensitive later in the evening, and it's nice to have a period where you do have some rest, digestion and everything. So lots of types of fasting, and that all gets lost again when we just kind of talk about it in this big umbrella kind of type of generalization. So
for sure.
I think we're going to talk a lot about protein here and muscle synthesis, but to be honest, I think people that are overweight and obese, they have to start there. Like they have to lose the weight, and there's ways to do that. Exercise and caloric restriction, both really effective. But getting back and speaking to the RDA for protein, it's funny because you mentioned the micronutrients, you mentioned vitamin C, and I did my postdoc with Bruce Ames, and I studied micronutrients, and like so I've his whole shtick was RDAs are like to prevent deficiency, and that they're just not adequate, so like vitamin D,
Another great
it
example,
goes on and on, right? And so I'm very familiar with that, where it's like, well, look, who wants to preventing scurvy is one thing, but not having DNA damage that's accumulating over time, that's going to lead to mutations, lead to cancer. Well, that's important. So maybe we should be thinking long term, right? So it's kind of like the same concept.
Exactly.
With respect to the 1.2 grams of protein per day, you talk. Let's talk a little bit more about specifics with people that are physically active. So you mentioned 1.6. Now there was the study that I think it was a meta-analysis out of your group that you guys looked at resistance exercise in adults younger than 65 and adults older than 65 and their protein intake. Can you talk a little bit about you looked at lean body mass and what was found there? What were the major findings?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's fair to say that our lab has contributed to maybe some of the overstatement of the importance of protein for muscle mass, and I'll throw my hands up and say, okay. Some early studies that we did, particularly where we were measuring rates of muscle protein synthesis, you sort of saw these enormous changes with protein, and everybody was like, see, it's important. And I'm like, absolutely. You begin to accumulate evidence, you begin to accumulate longer term trials where people are fed higher versus lower protein intakes, and the data looks sort of promising, but the more trials you get, it's sort of the effect tends to become a little bit smaller, a nuance, let's say. So I think that it's important that 1.2 is still the basal level, that's the buy-in. I think 1.6 grams per kilo, so, and I know people like to talk in pounds, so it's something around sort of 0.6 to 0.7 grams per pound. And those levels after that, you can digest and eat lots more protein. Your body just can't use it. But if you're a physically active younger person, we refer to protein turnover. And the concept I think that's easiest is to say, your muscle or your proteins in your body are like a brick wall. The amino acids are the bricks going in. Protein synthesis is the bricks going into the wall. But at the other end, there's a process of bricks, bad bricks, damaged bricks, old worn out bricks being taken out of the wall. So we're turning protein over constantly. And if you're performing exercise and you're going out, doesn't matter if you're running or lifting weights, then that protein turnover process is accelerated. So you have to put more bricks into the pool to replace the ones that are coming out. Sounds like a really inefficient process, but you can imagine if you did that every day to the walls around your house, they'd be in great shape. So it's a good thing. I think as you get older, what happens is that the bricks that are coming in aren't used as efficiently. but we're still pulling bricks out of the wall, and that sort of tips the balance in, and we begin to lose muscle mass. If you go into bed rest, we tip that in the opposite direction in a really severe way. And most people have experienced, and we use this as an experimental model, a period. You put a cast on your leg or your arm, you take the cast off, and then you look and you say, like, where did my leg or my arm go? Well, that's local muscular atrophy. But when you're young, most people ask, why don't we do rehab for young kids if they fall out of a tree and break their arm? The answer is we don't have to, because kids just go back and keep doing and playing, and that's their rehab. As we get older, we don't tend to do that, so we need active rehab. And I think that's then the period where you need to put more protein back into the system to try and restore that. It just becomes ridiculously difficult as you get older. So young people, physically active, I'm an advocate for higher protein intakes. I would agree that most of them, if they're particularly eating to cover their energy needs and consuming a mixed diet, they're probably good. Middle-aged people, and I'll be the first person to admit this, or probably not the first, we don't have a lot of data. And people ask why, and I'll give you the simple explanation. We can conduct lots of studies on university campuses as academic research institutions on young college-age people. There's lots of them around, willing participants in research. And we can conduct lots of research on people over the age of 65, as the meta-analysis sort of implies. The people in the middle, they're busy people. They've got kids, jobs, lots of things going on, and we say, hey, you got to come into the lab for a whole day, you got to do this, and they're like, I can't do that. So they're not studied often. I think the assumption, and it's a reasonable one, is you can draw probably a line, from young to older people, and the middle-aged people would be in the middle. So the meta-analysis was essentially then an attempt to reconcile, we've got all of these studies, what does protein do for lean body mass? And the answer is, if you're younger and you're resistance training, so you're lifting weights, you want to get a bit bigger, a bit stronger, 1.6 grams of protein per kilo per day was the type of intake that you need to consume. But the effect is small. So in other words, I like to, to put it practically, I say you get most of the benefit from just going to the gym, and then the protein effect is a thin layer on top. And it's the same story as you get a little bit older. The bad news, like a lot of things, although aging is great, you're more wise, you're everything else like that, but things slow down. And so the protein begins to add incrementally sort of smaller amounts. And so it's a small nudge. You get a little bit of extra strength, you get a little bit of extra muscle, but it's really the lifting of the weights that is the big driver of all of the benefits and all of the gains. So, simply put, protein is, we talk about, sufficient and necessary for a little bit of extra strength, but it's a thin slice on top of what lifting weights provides in terms of strength and muscle.
That makes sense. So the 1.2 is kind of going back to that number.
Yeah, you kind of need to start there, and then you can move up, but there's a ceiling.
Yeah.
And we could obviously have a discussion about should it be 1.6 something if you're here, or if you're in a caloric deficit, and I'm like, yeah, you could probably stand to eat a little bit more, because you're in a calorie deficit, again, you're sort of tipping the scales in the favor of the breakdown side of things. That's just, calorie deficits or catabolic stimuli, and it's catabolic for muscle too. So, there are probably situations where we need a little bit more, but how long, how much, those are really, let's call them fine details.
What about, is this also a fine detail, the protein timing? There's probably one of the most common questions.
Yeah.
Should I split my 1.2 grams into 3.4 grams per kilogram, or is the stimulus? And we'll talk more about why protein's a stimulus for muscle mass. But does it have to be higher? Or?
Yeah. Great question. Again, I'm drawing as much from evidence as I can here, and a little bit for my sort of own sense. So take this with a grain of sand. I think the way that your body is set up, and your muscles in particular, prefer to be fed regularly, so pulsed, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a snack or whatever it is. And so when I'm talking to athletes who are the creme de la creme, pro level, Olympic level, I get to talk to them only every now and again, and I always say, you guys are clearly, like, we've skimmed off everybody who is sort of a mere mortal like me. And now we've got these elite specimens, and they probably should eat that way. Now, I appreciate that sometimes training is difficult for them to do and everything else like that, but I think they could benefit from even distribution. Whether it's a huge effect, I think for most mere mortals, it's not a big deal. I think if you're the top level athlete and you're probably looking to medal or win this or win that, then maybe some of those small differences, that's the sort of the last little part that you need to turn the dial, that is the margin of victory at the top level. So we talk about even spacing of protein. I think for most people, it's not that big a deal. There's also the timing with respect to exercise, and I lived through that craze. Not as big a deal as we once thought. So it's really about the total amount of protein you're going to get in the day. And then the next one would be, even spacing, and I'd say, yeah. And then the next one would be sort of protein quality, where, we get into some of the more nuanced talk about protein. And then you can dial it down from there. Most people I talk to, I just say, do you go to the gym? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, how many times? They're like, well, once or twice. I said, maybe you could go 2 or 3 times. That would probably be a much bigger benefit than I need to divide my protein 3 times across the day. So
good point.
Yeah.
What about 65 years and older?
Oh, yeah. I think this is where what we call a skewed protein intake, and the traditional intake is lowest at breakfast, moderate at lunch, and then most of it at dinner. I think it's probably correct to say that breakfast time meal, you could really stand to push the protein intake a little bit higher. Most people say heart healthy breakfast, whole grains, that sort of thing, and so that's where they focus. When we've looked at intakes of older, particularly older women, they consume a ridiculously small amount of protein at breakfast, and I think they could handle, some Greek yogurt. We take eggs off the dirty list, and we say it's okay to eat an egg, good, high quality, nutrient-dense source of protein. And then they say cholesterol. I'm like, probably not as big a deal as you've been taught. And you're 85. I'm like, have an egg for goodness sake, or a glass of milk. And that's, most people say, well, there's not much protein. And I say, you're right, but it's more than the 6 to 8 grams, most of which comes from wheat gluten, which is, it's not a particularly high quality protein. That these older folks should probably aim for. And it doesn't necessarily, again, have to be enormous amounts. People say, what about protein supplements? I'm like, very convenient. If you can't do it with food, absolutely a protein supplement's probably useful. But, whatever suits your lifestyle. But I do think that older people, particularly, instead of having this skewed distribution, could stand to sort of have a more even distribution throughout the day.
Okay, so maybe we should talk about why protein is such a strong stimulus for increased muscle protein synthesis.
Yeah.
What is it about protein? The essential amino acids?
Yeah. So you said it. Go back to the brick wall analogy. If that's muscle protein, it's made up of 20 different types of bricks. Those are the 20 amino acids that we have, 9 of which are essential. We need to get them in our diet. And in particular, there are a group of what are called branch chain amino acids that are 3 of the 9. And the most potent, if you like, of the 3 branch chains is an amino acid called leucine. And the way I like to explain it to people is that it's kind of like the brick that when it arrives, it turns the process on. And I'm intentionally doing that because I always just like to remind people it's like a dimmer switch. So it's not, click on, click off. It's really like leucine comes along and it begins, you see the lights begin to come on, and the lights obviously are the process of making new muscle proteins. So once you have sufficient leucine there, you can turn the switch up as bright as it can go. Once you put more leucine there, you can't go any higher. For older people, for reasons that we're beginning to unravel now, I think what happens is now the sensitivity of that dimmer switch, so the leucine comes and you sort of get this response. In a younger person, you might get that. And so we need more leucine or more branch chains or more essential amino acids, which translates into you need more protein to trigger the whole turning the protein synthetic process on. So it's a pretty nuanced level, I think, of understanding, but we're beginning to see when we look at diets that people eat, that people who consume higher quality proteins or sufficient lower quality proteins, which I'm sure we'll get to, it's really about the leucine that they consume, particularly for their muscle, that's important.
So I have a question about that, but before we get there, the higher quality, obviously, animal meat is higher in essential amino acids than plant protein.
Yeah.
And so can people that are on a plant protein diet then get sufficient essential amino acids to foster muscle protein synthesis?
Great question. And, this is one area we chatted a little bit before I came on to say that my understanding and even the studies that I've been involved with has changed. And, so 20 years ago when I first came to McMaster, I'm like, here's a fundamental truism. Animal-derived proteins are higher quality than plant-derived proteins. Plant-derived proteins have anti-nutritional, fiber is one, phytates, lots of other things that can inhibit protein breakdown enzymes. And, I used to say that's a big deal. It's going to lower the quality. You're not going to get as many essential amino acids. And that's true. But, fast forward 20 years, we've now got processing methods that can lower or change the fiber content. We've got foods where we've isolated plant proteins, et cetera. So we've taken a lot of that out of the equation. And then everybody says, but the essential amino acid content is lower in plant proteins than it is in animal. And I'm like, essentially you're correct. The top of the list in the plant kingdom would obviously be soy. It's, plant-derived protein and probably been the mainstay of 20th and 21st century vegans or vegetarians. But now we're looking at a variety of plant-based protein sources that are contrived. They're manufactured foods, but they're very high quality proteins. They're not something that people need to worry about in terms of I'm getting an inferior, quote unquote, source of protein. So I think that the way you can make up for the difference is you either eat a little more over here in terms of protein, or you go towards supplements or foods that actually have taken some of the anti-nutritional out. Or, and this has been something that we're keenly aware of and trying to study, is that a lot of the prep methods of plant proteins like beans and legumes, you cook them. And cooking actually liberates a lot of the proteins and makes them more bioavailable, and so reduces the anti-nutritional effects. So sprouting, cooking, fermentation, all kinds of things that are commonly done with plant-based proteins, beans, legumes, I think are making the two proteins much more close in quality inside us than we once thought. And so I tend to worry less about protein quality than I once did. And I know that probably upsets a lot of people because they're like, well, you used to say, and I was like, you're right, I used to say that, but the evidence is evolving, and even in our own hands, we've been, I think I've been surprised actually at how good plant proteins have been in stimulating muscle protein synthesis. So.
That's really good to know.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask you this because I know people listening or watching this are going to ask, and when you're talking about fiber and the effect of fiber on, being able to absorb proteins, you're talking about within a plant. You're not like talking about eating your plate of spinach with your steak. Inhibiting the absorption.
That's different. Yeah. I mean, the steak and the spinach, still good mix. Great if you enjoy to eat that way. But no, I'm talking about, and I mean, here's the other sort of knock on some of the studies that we use to make these generalisms. People are fed individual foods, And that's really not how we eat. We tend to, you look at a plate and it's got something like this. But when you do that, I think the point I'm making is the fiber that's intrinsic to the plant or the fruit or whatever it is inhibiting to some small degree your absorption of the protein that's there. But those effects, again, you cook a bean or a pea, and a lot of that goes away. So raw peas, and if you eat raw peas, okay. But if you cook the peas, they're a lot more digestible. And so, a lot of the studies that we have to look at protein digestibility and the amino acid scores, and there are lots of them, but I don't think are as big of a deal as we once thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You talking about the leucine and kind of circling back to that, I want to get into underlying causes of sarcopenia, but kind of before that we get there, the leucine supplementation does come up in my mind. Sure. And probably in a lot of other people's minds. It's like, can I supplement with leucine and not have to take in so much protein and have a similar effect on muscle protein synthesis?
Yeah, really great question. And we have done some studies where we haven't, a proof of principle, we supplemented people with leucine, and we did find that it improved the response. A little, the caveat statements. First of all, leucine is, of all of the 20 amino acids, and I know everybody hasn't, done this sort of thing, but leucine it's extraordinarily bitter. So it doesn't taste great. So you need a bit of food science to take that edge off, I think. From my perspective, that would be sort of a last resort, because it's really, it should always be a food first approach, and then maybe a supplement, and now you're bringing it down to the individual component. And you probably get a sense of this from some of the studies that we've seen with individually purified components of, like, a tomato, and it was, it's lycopene, that's really important, when actually there's things in the whole tomato, the matrix and other things, and lots of bioactive compound. We have no idea what they're doing, and probably the tomato is better for you than just the lycopene alone. So, that's my my sort of ethos statement, to say, leucine supplementation, if you must. Buyer beware. Make sure it comes from a reputable company. The internet is rife with crummy supplements, and you just need to know where it's coming from. So usually look for third-party testing. I tend to like domestic production, so North America if you can. And then a lot of people say, well, what about branch chain supplements? And I'm like, it's really interesting. Like, they've stuck around as a sports supplement for a long, long time. I think the message is fairly clear now that they're largely, I won't say useless, but from useful to useless, they're a lot closer to the useless end. But it's only the leucine out of those 3 amino acids that's the important branch chain amino acids. So they work because of the leucine. So then people say, well, I'm on a high protein diet, I supplement with whey, and I'm taking branch chains. And there's a great Instagram meme where I see a guy in a pool, it's raining, and he's drinking water. So it's sort of like, that's where the branch chains are. I'm like, you're surrounded by good stuff. The branch chains are probably not a big deal. But for older people, we've done some work, and it's possible you're going to see products that are fortified with a little bit of extra leucine.
Do you absorb leucine, like, in free form?
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be a certain form?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, you absorb it in free form. In fact, it's really readily absorbed. The big barrier in all the studies we've ever done is how to mask its taste. So you can imagine, given its taste profile, we mix it with some sort of citrus and citrus fruit flavor, and try and sort of blend that sharp bitter edge into, like, it's lemon, it's orange, it's grapefruity, something, and that tends to be a good mix. But I'm not a food scientist. Pineapple, yeah, something like that.
So you said 4 to 5 for older individuals,
yeah.
Let's say, that are, as you mentioned, when you get older, your satiation, like, those hormones are all different, and
Yep.
people don't eat as much.
Right.
They're not hungry as much.
Yep.
And they certainly don't chew as well. I mean, all sorts of factors,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So if you can get, if you can get someone who's having a hard time, like there's just no way they're going to get 0.4 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. Like
Right.
the leucine supplementation may help with that older person.
Yeah, we've shown that. And I mean, I think it's not just our work. Lots of other people, collaborators of mine, good friends of mine, have shown the same thing, that if you take even a small protein dose and you add a little bit of extra leucine, you can make it look as if it's a bigger protein dose. And so, our dimmer switch analogy is that, here's a small protein dose and you get that response. Here's the small protein dose with leucine, and now you get a slightly greater response.
Was it 4 to 5 grams? What was it?
The per meal leucine dose is probably somewhere in the range of sort of 3 to 4 grams for an older person, probably 2 to 3 for younger, and that's just because the younger person is really sensitive to the effects. But we can make a younger person, when we put a brace on their leg and we get local atrophy, their atrophied muscle looks like an older person's response. So the disuse response, we think, is it's almost a model of premature aging in terms of your muscle anyway. The difference is a young person does this and they just bounce back. An older person does this and now they're down here.
So why? Can you talk a little bit about this, as I've heard or read in your publications, and I'm sure others as well, this anabolic resistance decline? Like what is that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I don't think that you can discount inactivity with aging. Everything as it gets older, from earthworms all the way up to humans, we do less as we age. There's no question about that. We have done some studies where we've used step reduction, like abrupt step reduction, as a model of sort of abrupt sedentarism, where we can make older people much more anabolically resistant as a result of that. So clearly activity is a driver of it. At the same time, I think there's probably aspects to do with insulin resistance, and it doesn't need to be overt insulin resistance to the degree that you have type 2 diabetes, but maybe you have what we call vascular insulin resistance. And what this means is that when you turn on insulin, you usually open up blood vessels to allow flow to happen. And what we think happens with aging is that response becomes just a little bit less sensitive. You're not insulin resistant from the perspective of blood sugar, but from a protein perspective, we think that opening up local capillaries and allowing good blood flow in older people just isn't quite as sensitive. So again, people say, wow, what can I do? And the number one answer is to be as physically active as you can. And that maintains that vascular level sensitivity as you get older. Aging is going to get you at some point, there's no question. But clearly, as you've said, the cornerstone is to maintain your physical activity levels, be as active as possible. Aerobic exercise, absolutely. Resistance exercise, it's got to be there.
And what about in terms of how many times a week resistance exercise? Because you hear about you mentioned the, there's the 10,000 steps. People talk about the 10,000 steps, right? So I mean, is there something people can think about? And does it age dependent? Does that change as well, right?
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, the origins of 10,000 steps is also probably, people go, where does that come from? And you're like, that's a good question. It's a great round number. I think that's, when you go back to the history of those little pedometers, it was just, that's a good number. And it's probably true, the closer you get to around 6, 7, 8,000, 9,000, 10, you start to see health benefits. So I'm not going to dismiss that. Resistance training, it's a little bit more difficult. Most of the guidelines you look around the world, there's a recommendation for 2 times a week of strengthening activities. My own feeling is that it should be more than recommended. It should be a de rigueur part of the guidelines, like 150 minutes. And I do think 2 days a week is that's the buy-in level. I mean, if somebody's doing nothing and they do 1, big change. They do 2, big change. I think 3, bigger change. 4, I'm like, I don't know, you're probably starting to see the plateau. 5, I'm like, yes, if it's your thing. 6, you go. 7, you're mad, but go for it. But it's a dose response, like a lot of things, right? 150 minutes is kind of where we tap out a lot of the benefits, and then you go from there to say double in 300 minutes, and you can squeeze a little bit more out of the cloth, but you've kind of got a lot of the benefits with the first 150.
Let's say you're doing, so that's 150 minutes of strength.
That's aerobic exercise. Sorry, yeah.
So then when you're talking about, let's say you were doing the 2 days a week of resistance training, what's the duration for each of those? Is it?
Here's where we climb inside the really kind of nuanced things, and it's sort of like, do we do free weights, we do machines, we do sets, we do reps, and everything. And this is actually, I think, one of the barriers for a lot of people is that most people, I say 10,000 steps, they're like, oh, walking, I can do that. And then you say weightlifting, they're like, oh, I hate going to the gym. And you're like, okay, well, have you ever done a push-up? And they're like, yeah, but I hate push-ups. And most people hate push-ups because they were used as a form of punishment when you were a kid. At least that's my feeling. But you don't need a gym to do resistance workouts. You can do body weight workouts just about anywhere. You can do like an air squat up and down, and you don't need a weight. But sets, reps, my main point is getting to do that at least twice a week for, let's say, 30 to 45 minutes duration. There's a lot of benefit associated with that. I think 3 times you can get a little bit more, but it's about making clear that the biggest reduction in risk, bar none, is always going from nothing to doing something. And not that we should aim at the smallest or the lowest bar or anything else like that, but as we mentioned, I was saying before we got on camera, these nudges of people that are really sedentary at a population level, if we got everybody to walk for even 10 minutes a day, and then maybe they did a push-up, even if they can't do a floor push-up, let's say a wall push-up, and maybe went how to walk outside, how good they would feel, mental health, physical health, and everything. And the population effects would be pretty substantial. So I'm good if if you're like me and you like to go to the gym and you like to lift some weights. I don't lift heavy weights anymore. I think that's sort of a diabolical pursuit, but if that's your thing, go for it. But I think it's more about getting to the gym, performing a workout with pretty high levels of effort, which is I stopped prescribing percentages of your maximal lift. I just say lift until you're pretty fatigued at the end, and you should do pretty well.
And when you're lifting or you're doing any type of resistance and or strength training, you are also causing muscle protein breakdown.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? Yeah.
But the mechanical force on the muscles are increasing protein synthesis, or what are they doing?
No, that's great. Great explanation. Yeah, I mean, I think our wall analogy again is to say that actually exercise, physical exercise, and particularly some forms, but weightlifting is a really potent one, turns up the rate at which we're pulling bricks out of the wall. You're creating damage. You're creating a stress on the muscle. Successful adaptation to stress is that you're able to repair that damage and replace those damaged proteins, and that's the synthesis side of things. And then, clearly what we're aiming for is, so we have damage and then we have synthesis, but now you've gone up a little bit, and then we have damage, synthesis, and over time, it's sort of down, up, down, up, down, up, but the trend is that you're getting better and better. The same with aerobic exercise. I mean, it's, I'd say to people, like, the exercise is great, but it's in recovery that's where all the good stuff happens, because we, as a result, repair any damage, recover from the stress, and hopefully recover fully so that we're at a better starting point. Again, sometimes it's small changes, but over time, people say, when I first started, I was so tired. And I'm like, yeah, it's hard work when you first get started. Get past month 1, month 2, month 3, and then now you're 6 months later, you're like, I'm so much stronger, I'm so, et cetera, et cetera. It takes time, and the stress is stress. You have to overcome it, but the benefits are massive.
Does the recovery, is there certain, like if you're doing the strength training, let's say you do 30 minutes one day, like should you take, do you taking the next day off matter, or can you like do it 2 days in a row and then recover? Is that just?
Again, these are the sorts of things I think, when you become more advanced. So now I'm like, okay, I've got 3 days in the gym a week. I've got that down, no problem. And it becomes, what more can I do to sort of maximize what I'm getting out of the workout that I'm doing? Most people split, say, a resistance workout. They might pair exercises, or the most rudimentary one is sort of say there are pushing exercises, so that above your head. There are pulling exercises, or a bicep curl, and then there are leg exercises. So pushing, pulling, legs, and you're working different muscle groups, and that's 3 days a week. It gives you, the muscle has lots of time to recover. Some people do it really differently. The bodybuilding culture gets into individual body parts. So today is a bicep day, the next day is a tricep day. Monday is usually always chest day. You're under the bar doing a bench press. You work on your legs, you work on your lower legs, you work on your upper legs. All of those are things that ways of splitting it up. I think my advice to most people is to say you can probably break most resistance exercises down into some pretty basic ones. There is a push from your back, that's a bench press. There's a shoulder press above your head. I'm not a big fan of isolation exercises, but squatting or a leg press, if you don't want to squat, is really, those are the three sort of, if you walked away and remember nothing, those are great exercises. You don't need to do too much more, to be honest with you, but you branch out from there. I do think some people can handle a lot more. I know from my own experience when I was younger, I could do a heck of a lot more, and the recovery came a lot easier. Now, not so much, and the goals are different. My goal now is, it has a 20-year horizon, 30-year horizon. So that's something I'm like, how long does it take to recover? I'm like, well, I don't know. I took a day off yesterday. I was okay.
Does protein help with recovery? I mean, how much of a role does, for example, we talked about leucine, how much does essential amino acids like that activate IGF-1? Does IGF-1 play a role in muscle repair?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think, as I said, it's in recovery where all the good stuff happens. Like the workout is putting the stress on the muscle and the bones, the joints, etc. And then the recovery part, the stress is removed, and it's like, okay, now it's repair time, recovery time. 3 hours, rehydrate, refuel, repair. So you got to get fluid back in if you've lost that. It's a primary one. You got to get fuel back in, particularly if the next day you're going to do another workout. The repair part, that's where the protein comes in. There's a lot of thoughts that the regenerative process also involves hormones going up and everything else. And I think for a large part, particularly when you're an adult, that's a non-issue. Most of the restorative process and the recovery process is driven almost exclusively by macronutrients. And so IGF-1, I'm like, needs to be there, but it's not a stimulatory or an inhibitory hormone for repair or recovery.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about mechanisms and because there was definitely some surprises and interesting, findings when I was reading a lot of the literature, and including predominantly yours. So what leucine, its major role in activating muscle protein synthesis is through mTOR?
Yes, through mTOR. Very good.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, mTOR is one of these, it's a highly conserved protein. It's a sort of an integrative nexus of all kinds of anabolic stimuli, including resistance exercise, or any form of exercise. It's actually running through mTOR. Leucine goes through mTOR. Its dysregulation is involved in all kinds of processes, including cancer and lots of other things. So it has a really centrally important role in integrating all of those anabolic signals. There are some thoughts now that there are actually two complexes of mTOR, one that's sensitive to nutrients, one that's actually more sensitive to exercise. And one functions a little bit different than the other, but the ultimate culmination is that the downstream signals after you've stimulated mTOR are to turn on protein synthesis and all of the regenerative or anabolic processes to repair any or recover from any stress that's been exposed. So yeah, it's essentially important protein. We study it a lot. We're by no means experts in it. There are people that are far better at it than I am. So
yeah. So inhibiting the one like mTORC1, which is the nutrient sensitive complex, with something like rapamycin, could affect muscle protein synthesis, but not because there's also mTORC2 activity going on. If a person is resistance training, maybe is it not as big of a deal, or is it still does affect it?
I mean, I think, like I said, the benefits of the resistance training probably through mTOR2 are like this. You still get the protein synthetic response. With mTORC1, I mean, that's where the sort of thinner layer of the nutrient added stimulation goes on top of resistance training. So, as you say, one's sensitive to rapamycin, the other one actually isn't. So, the more we uncover with this, the more we realize we probably, 10 years ago we thought we had it figured out. Nah, we're not even close. And so now we're beginning to understand that mechanical stress from exercise is rooted through a different process than nutrient stimulation of protein synthesis. So, maybe that's the underpinning mechanism why a lot of people talk about, restricting protein and not wanting to turn on the overly turn on the anabolic side of things, and because uncontrolled growth and at cell level, that's cancer. But as I point out to people, persistent exercise also activates mTOR on an almost chronic basis if you exercise every day. And now we're like, well, actually it's signaling through a different process. So maybe that's why it's beneficial, and this one, if it's chronically turned up, is not so good.
Yeah, and it also goes back to some of the observational data we were talking about also a couple hours ago, or whenever it was, when you're looking at protein intake, specifically animal protein versus plant protein, and animal protein, as you pointed out, is higher in essential amino acids, including leucine. And, so you look at these all-cause mortalities and these cancer-related mortalities, and there is definitely conflicting data for sure. But there is an overall, there's a lot of studies showing that there's a lower all-cause mortality and a lower cancer-related mortality in people that consume plant proteins. However, when you start to look at the largest observational studies that have been done, those studies that have looked for any unhealthy lifestyle factors or confounding factors have found that, actually people that have no unhealthy lifestyle factors, so they're not obese, not sedentary, not smoking, not excessively drinking alcohol, they have a similar all-cause mortality as a plant-eating person. So, again, it goes down to that, okay, well, maybe if someone is obese and smoking or sedentary, before you start eating a lot of protein and worrying about that, let's get rid of those unhealthy lifestyle factors, right? Let's get physically active. Let's lose some weight, some fat, and then then things can kind of fall into place. So
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think in sort of the broad checklist, and people say, so what are you doing to age well? And I said, well, I'm trying to stay at a body weight that's not excessive. I weigh more now than I did when I was 13, 14, no kidding. I'm more than I did when I was 23, 24, but not much more. I'm physically active. I pay attention to what I eat 80% of the time, and people say, well, what about the other 20%? I said, that's why I exercise, so I can indulge myself 20% of the time. I don't need a vegan diet. I don't need a vegetarian diet, but I eat less meat, particularly red meat, than I used to. I eat more fish. I don't eat as many, refined carbohydrates. I don't really have a sweet tooth, so I was kind of lucky in that way. So I don't feel compelled. I'm weak in the presence of chocolate, but maybe that's my one indulgence. But I don't smoke, never have. I don't drink as much as I used to. All of those things, and you're going check, 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 check. And then people go, well, what about intermittent fasting? And I'm like, you know what? And again, it's this is the analogy. I love this, is you dip the water, or you dip the cloth in the water, and the first ring is like you get a lot of water out. I'm like, that's maintaining your body weight. I'm like, the second one is physical activity. The third one is watch what you eat. The fourth one is, and then you could add subtle nuanced things more on that. But now it's only little drops that are coming out of the cloth. That's where I think a lot of the finer details, the vegan versus, omnivorous diet, if you're judicious about how you plan your omnivorous diet, can make a difference. Yeah, if you're a smoker, that's a great thing to give up, because that's a bona fide shortened lifespan, poor quality of life, etc. But I understand the power of addiction, and particularly if you started early, which is when most people take it up, man, it's a tough one to break. So
lose the weight, physically active. I think what you said is pretty fair. Like the most important things.
Some broad strokes.
And then the little drops that can come out.
Yep.
Hormones.
Yeah.
Growth hormone.
Yeah.
Testosterone. I mean, getting to the sex hormones.
Yeah.
I was quite surprised by, some of the data coming out of your lab.
Yeah.
That showed, and maybe you can explain it because you'll explain it better than I do, but looking at what effect, for example, growth hormone has on muscle protein synthesis.
Yeah. So this started in to give you the origins or the genesis of this story. I was early in my faculty appointment, and we were doing these studies where we were infusing people with labeled amino acids to measure the rate of muscle protein synthesis. So we were measuring the incorporation of these amino acids, and we had people exercising. These were mostly young men. Freely admit that. We're making a push to do younger women and older women and middle-aged women, perimenopausal women. So stay tuned, it's coming. And we would send it in for publication, and they said, you haven't measured, testosterone, growth hormone, or insulin-like growth factor. And they go up after exercise, and they're driving this protein synthetic response. And my training is as a biochemist. I'm not an exercise physiologist. I'm a varsity athlete, so pairing the two seemed logical to me. And I'd actually worked with some people that were pretty good with steroid biochemistry. And my understanding was that steroid hormones, testosterone, that sort of thing, slid across membranes, bound to a receptor went into the nucleus, modified the expression of genes. And that takes a long time. That's not a transitory, testosterone's up, they do this, and 15 minutes later it's back down. And growth hormone, the same thing. So we thought, we need to test this. We either need to show that those hormones are important or they're not. And so that's why we don't think we need to measure them. And it's a journey that it's taken us, 20 years, probably about 4 PhD students, a couple of good postdocs. So it's been a good one. Lots of people have chipped in. And we've tried very, very hard to show that those hormones have an anabolic effect. And we've never been able to see it. And we've manipulated all kinds of experimental conditions, and we just don't see an impact. I think the most damning evidence against testosterone as a big driver of muscle protein synthesis is to say, if you take men and women, and agreed, like men start out with more muscle mass than women, and you resistance train them, and this is a meta-analysis now, a guy named Brandon Roberts did this one, and you resistance train them relative to what they started with, everybody goes up the same amount. Women get the same amount of muscle growth as men do, but they had less muscle to start with because, boys and girls are like this. Puberty happens, boys become men, mannish, and that's the testosterone surge. But after that, they just they follow each other. So the big T, not so important. Now, this is where people say, but steroids work. I'm like, absolutely. So this is the normal diurnal variation in testosterone. This is steroids. It's about 2 to 3 standard deviations away, and if the person is taking it either orally or as an injectable, it's up all the time. And whereas we're talking about transient fluctuations in hormones throughout the day. If you take men and they have a diagnosis of prostate cancer, they're often put on androgen deprivation therapy. So they're taken from a normal testosterone state to a hypogonadal state. And yeah, they lose muscle mass. They actually, it's almost a feminizing process for these guys, but it's good news for the prostate tumor, which is a reproductive hormone-driven tumor. And you know, the dirty secret that we're trying to sort of, you know, our lab and lots of others are trying to sort of convince and talk to women, particularly around menopause, is it's not just bone that drops off, it's muscle too. And that's the loss of estrogen-mediated stimulation of protein synthesis. So, you know, that's the sort of the testosterone story, and I think it's pretty much we can put that one to bed. Now, I will say this, is there's a lot of people making a lot of noise and a lot of water about certain supplements that boost testosterone and do this, that, and the other. And I just came from the American College of Sports Medicine meetings and listened to a great talk. A good friend of mine, Eric Rawson, said, you know, this is a case of what's old is new. There have been, in my 25-year career now at McMaster, probably about 24 testosterone boosting supplements that I've seen come and go. And then it seems like we just can't get rid of them. So there's another, you know, there's 2 or 3 hot ones out now, and I won't name them, but let's just say, you know, I get DMs on Instagram, which one should I take? I'm like, save your money. Like, why bother? Like, just get to the gym and lift. And that tends to upset a lot of people. I do think, however, if you go and you look back at, you know, it was androstenedione, androstenediol, it was it was a hormone precursor. I'm having trouble getting my tongue around here. It was plant-based hormones, it was et cetera, et cetera. None of these, you know, fenugreek, none of these things have worked. Again, look at the sum totality of the research, not one study, not one person talking about this on an Instagram reel. I think you just need to step back and, you know, Phillips' quote unquote 3 rules of supplements, taken from a good mentor of mine, Ron Mon. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. If it's too good to be true, it's probably banned, or you need a big prescription for it. There may be some exceptions as rule number 3, but there are very few. So the growth hormone story is another one, and the easiest way I sort of like to try and explain that to people is the lack of growth hormone when you're young, so classical hypopituitarism, leads to shorter stature, dwarfism. Those individuals have an amount of muscle mass that's directly proportional to their stature. If you have hyperpituitarism, you're a giant. You're just tall. You don't have excessive muscle mass. You have it directly proportional to your stature. So growth hormone is a stimulator of stature, you know, your height. So it's good for bones. It's actually really good for collagen. And everybody goes, collagen? Your bone is actually about 40% by composition protein. It's not just a stick of chalk. There's a layer of collagenous protein around it. But this may be where collagen has achieved its sort of notoriety, particularly in the supplemental form for athletes, is it stimulates collagenous tissue synthesis. And if you think about it, so you take testosterone, your muscles get bigger. They probably get big enough that you can do ridiculous things in terms of lifting really heavy weights, but to the degree that you can tear your muscle right off of a tendon, and it happens. And so where the growth hormone comes in, this is my own personal theory, is it stimulates collagenous synthesis, and so the tendons become stronger too. And laced throughout your muscle are collagenous proteins. So that's where growth hormone is beneficial. So we're in California. I'll invoke Victor Balco and say, you have to get the cream and you have to get the clear, and that's the steroid hormones and the growth hormone. You need both of them to be a big, strong guy. But both of those hormones are anabolic and therefore pro-cancer hormones. Chronic elevations of those hormones mess with a lot of systems that we're only beginning to understand. So excessive testosterone or high levels, great driver of prostate growth. Excessive growth hormone, a great driver of lots of different tissues, but its lack, and this is where you've had Dr. Longo on the show before. He shows in certain populations of dwarves, for example, who have a particular type of dwarfism and lack a growth hormone receptor, they don't get cancer. So do we really want to mess with that system is my question. And I think that, us showing that they don't have a particularly huge role, at least within the normal variation, is a lot different than people coming out to the extremes down here. And if you're clinically low in those hormones, by all means. But for most guys, I'd stay away from that stuff.
You have shown that androgen receptor content increases with resistance training and is correlated with muscle protein synthesis.
Yep.
Did I understand that correctly? Yep. What do you think then? Because the androgen, does testosterone also increase androgen receptor?
So it probably does a little bit as a sort of a feed-forward mechanism, but I think that there's a little bit of a feedback mechanism, the nature of which I'm not entirely sure, but that you can only get so much androgen receptor. But you're entirely right, as I said, the testosterone or other steroid hormones, estrogen as well, bind to receptors, and those receptors turn on genes. And so the content of the receptors may be, we think anyway, and others have shown the same thing, the rate limiting action of where the testosterone probably is having any action, if it's having any action at all. And the same for estrogen. So.
Okay, so there could be some, and maybe other metabolites that are binding to it. So
we're scratching the surface with the big ones. There's lots of other downstream hormones that we're not looking at for sure.
Well, that makes a lot of sense with the extremes, because those were, you pretty much answered my questions, which were, you inject, people with testosterone and muscle growth goes up, but it's super physiologic. Same with growth hormone though, right?
Absolutely.
Super physiologic.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's not just so much of the transient increase that you're getting from the exercise, but this constant, where it's just elevated for hours and hours and hours.
Yeah, and it's not like I said, the diurnal range is so ridiculously small as opposed to where steroids are or where growth hormone administration is. That the comparison of normal changes, I'm a high testosterone responder, or I'm a low testosterone, or I'm a high growth hormone, et cetera. It's not the same as talking about somebody who's taking exogenous supplemental hormones. They're completely different paradigms. So you can't invoke this as proof of that, if you like. The deficiency end is interesting, and I can see the clinical case for treating hypogonadal men if they have low testosterone, or kids with classic hypopituitarism to get them to probably not the stature that they would have if they're completely normal, but certainly not short. Some people choose not to do it. Some people just say, no, that's how I was born, that's the way it is. I can respect that, but at the same time, you could make a case. Where I differ with some of these sort of exogenous, they call themselves anti-aging clinics, is that the anti-aging that you get as a result of taking the hormone is maybe at the expense of overstimulation of anabolic or cell division, cancer, et cetera. To the degree that it's doing you more harm than good. And I think unless it's closely managed, you need to be aware of that.
Are you talking about hormone replacement therapy? What about people that are doing hormone replacement therapy that are mimicking more what your physiologic levels would be?
And that's the paradigm. So if this is the normal range of testosterone, and most guys, they point out that it's quite wide, and it is. So you can be just this side of it or just this side of it, and you're at the low end of normal. And bringing you into the normal range, that's clinical treatment. And it's the same for women at menopause taking supplemental estrogen to bring themselves back to where they were premenopausally. I understand that, but those are closely monitored clinical situations, or bringing you, with growth hormone injections back to here. I think where the difference is the sort of, I'll call it the Wild West of these anti-aging clinics, where people just go take this, and there's no monitoring of what happens, or it's a physique-driven process, and so older guys say, look at me now, and I'm like, that's great, you look great. I hope there's nothing, with your prostate or elsewhere that's growing. That's all.
And that again comes down to our lifestyle and physical activity, which, as you said, 20% you're eating your bad stuff, but you're physically
bad stuff.
active.
I indulge.
You indulge. Okay.
A slice of cheesecake is okay. A hot dog at a ball game is okay, in my opinion. But
especially if you're a physically active person and you're not eating it for every meal every day, right? I mean, so again, it comes down to, I think, also, back to some of the observational studies where, if you are going to do hormone replacement therapy, and like maybe there's a reason, evolutionary speaking, like that our bodies start to make less of those growth factors and hormones as we age, maybe because cancer incidence goes up. And so if you're not taking care of the other factors that can lead to cancer, like exercise, is one of the best known ways to lower risk of many different cancers, including hormonal ones.
Yes.
Then you probably shouldn't be thinking about hormone replacement therapy until you figure out the physical activity part first, right? So,
preaching to the choir, but great, great. No. I think it's a really relevant point to say that, as you say, the benefits of exercise never stop. I mean, it's almost embarrassing to talk about how good it is for you. You talked about cancer. 13 of the 26 most common types of cancer are lower in people who have higher levels of leisure time physical activity. And so that's not exercise, that's gardening, that's walking, that's like, just the general day-to-day, not, moving around, not sitting down all the time. And we were talking before the show to say, I have a colleague, I'll give her a shout out, Jen Heiss, just wrote a great book on the mental health benefits of exercise. And 15, 20 years ago, if you said, well, you can change the size of your hippocampus in your brain with exercise, it would have been like, right, you can. You get improvements in mood, you get improvements in depressive symptoms, anxiety and everything, almost of the magnitude similar to people, taking pharmaceutical, interventions for those things. So it's just a win-win-win-win-win. If it's a pill, everybody would be on it.
Absolutely. I kind of want to just, because it's a good transition into the sauna, the growth hormone story, because I've been a routine sauna user since about 2009. Long time. I used to go every day. It was like really for me, it was like in grad school. I would go into the sauna before I go into the lab, and it really seemed to help with my anxiety. It helped me, so I started to read about it. It was like, something's going on here, right? Sure. And I came into this whole growth hormone literature where I was like, holy crap, you could do like 2 or 3 back-to-back sauna sessions separated by, 5 or 10 minutes of cooling, and you could get up to like a 16-fold transient elevation in growth hormone.
Yes.
And so at the time, I was thinking, because I had used it so much through periods of injury and when I usually lose muscle mass, and it was very apparent to me, subjectively speaking, that I was not losing muscle mass. And so at the time, it's like growth hormone, that's it, because it's an anabolic hormone, of course. It's, net protein synthesis will be increased. And turns out I was probably wrong about that part. So
I think the way to think about these hormones is that when we're kids and we're growing, you need growth hormone to grow. IGF-1 is a pro-growth factor. Once you're finished your linear and sort of broad growth, these hormones are mostly, in the case of growth hormone, it's actually a fat mobilizing hormone. That's it. One of its great side effects if you're taking exogenous growth hormone, you notice you get leaner. It probably doesn't do much for your muscle. I do think that there's something to the heat exposure probably outside of growth hormone that, at the local level, we're beginning to appreciate that the stress of the sauna, so it is stressful, it's a thermal stress, but it sort of recreates, quote unquote, mimics some aspects of exercise. And we talked about, hot yoga is one of these great sort of not only relaxing, therapeutic, but you're physically active, you're stretching muscles, but you're doing it in the heat. So there's a big thermal stress, and your cardiovascular system absolutely is like, wow, we're under siege here, heart rate goes up, everything else like that. But our muscles begin to turn on what we call heat shock proteins. So these heat shock proteins are, as the name implies, they were discovered when we people applied local heating. And for a long time, they were like, I don't know what these proteins do, but what we understand now is that they chaperone, or they act as essentially little proteins that bind to other proteins to prevent them from being what we call misfolded. And part of the stress response, and so as the name implies, could be stress due to exercise, could be stress due to sickness, could be stress, you name it, is that more proteins are misfolded. So, and people, what about misfolded proteins? And I said, well, a protein is a string of amino acids, and then it sort of bends in on itself, and then it does, all kinds of things, and it twists into a shape that is its final shape for it to be useful. But sometimes it doesn't do that, and it does something else. And let's say it doesn't fold into the shape it should be. And stress proteins help those proteins maintain and get into that appropriate folded structure. So yes, I think you were getting benefits. I don't know that the growth hormone was a big part of it, but definitely the heat shock protein response is, I think, and we're beginning to see more and more that you can alleviate muscle atrophy, and even in some patient groups with various forms of muscular dystrophy, that actually, heating and exercise could have synergistic benefits. So again, pulling away some of the covers on this, it's a fascinating area. So, and the other part, and we talked about this too, you feel good afterwards. And as I said, at the top levels of athletic performance, like the feeling good part is, you can't undervalue that. Even if the physiologists go, there's nothing to it, and the athlete says, I feel good, right? And the physiologist goes, oh, okay, well, you scored 3 goals last night, so who am I gonna, I can't argue, So feeling good is big.
It is. I'm glad you brought up the heat shock proteins, because that, to my credit, I did publish a review last August where I talked all about the heat shock proteins being responsible for the preventing and much muscle atrophy. With there's been animal studies that I had cited many years ago, and they've been sort of redone in a sense in some local applied heat therapy studies where they're preventing atrophy from disuse.
Yes.
And so again, back to this elderly population. So I've been able to get my mother in the sauna. I have a sauna, and there's only so much you can do with someone who has not spent their entire life being physically active.
Correct.
And I find that it's easier to get her in the sauna, and so I'm mimicking to some degree a little bit of moderate aerobic exercise. And then hopefully also getting some heat shock proteins to help with muscle atrophy, which she's battling, everyone, as we're getting older, are battling. So it's really nice to hear that you said that on the depression. I'll send you my article. You'll read it, but there's a whole section because there's been a sham controlled trial looking at the effects of heat stress on major depressive disorder. Right. There was a sham controlled. Basically it had an antidepressant effect, and I'm collaborating with someone, I'm a small collaborator, I'm the biomarker person, but Dr. Ashley Mason, she's at UCSF, she's now running a large randomized controlled trial on this, and so that's in the works right now.
But the thermal stress side of things, you wonder, so here's exercise, there's thermal stress, but there's muscular activity. So you're talking, I'll call it passive thermal stress. I mean, they must cross over, and so would it be surprising that one sort of mimics part of what the other does? And so
So I have a question for you, because as I was reading some of your reviews, something that came up was, looking into the causes of sarcopenia, the many causes.
Yes.
But even down to like looking at the molecular and the muscle tissue level, there was this degradation or a proteostasis. Basically proteostasis was messed up.
Yes.
In type 2, was it type 2 muscle fibers?
Yep.
And I was wondering if the heat shock proteins in sauna may play a very specific role in countering that type of.
So if you'd asked me that, and here's where, never stop learning begins, even 3 or 4 weeks ago, I would have had to say, I'm not really sure. I had the pleasure of attending the International Biochemistry of Exercise Conference in Toronto, so it was an easy one for me to get to, just 2 weeks ago. And there was discussion about this sort of heating aspect of things and heat shock protein response and what it could do in terms of a protective measure against atrophy. And maybe it's important. And it was in the context of somebody who was talking about the benefits of exercise for people with various forms of dystrophy. But let's just say it's muscle loss and the heat shock protein response as in the role that I described as a chaperone protein, but also in other ways that we're probably not understanding as well, could be beneficial. And I definitely wouldn't want to dismiss that. I do think that there is enough evidence to be at least interested and raise your eyebrows and say, this is deserving of greater and deeper study. So again, like I said, honestly, 3 or 4 weeks ago, I mean, like, I don't know, but I heard a great exchange between a former mentor of mine and a good friend who is an extraordinarily bright individual. And they both sort of nodded and thought, you know what, this is something that there's something going on. So I'm still learning. We're all still learning. So yeah, never say never.
Yeah, I mean, if you ever want to, I got Dr. Jari Laukkanen. He's in Eastern Finland. He's a friend of mine, and he's got lots of samples and looking for collaborators always. So there's lots of possibilities there, because I would love to sort of connect people and try to ask the right questions and see if we can answer them. I mean, that would be...
Well, it's an interesting one to answer because it seems that the heat shock response is something you can locally induce, right? It doesn't have to be a sauna. So you can heat one leg and not the other leg, for an example. So these are always the things that kind of pop in my mind. I'm like, how could we study that in the most efficient way possible? Do we need to put people in the sauna? Not that wouldn't be good,
right?
But maybe we could do local heating. And again, the cardiovascular effects to do with that and opening up capillaries and so more perfusion of them. I mean, there's all kinds of things that are suggestive that there could be something going on there, yeah, for sure.
Well, before we wrap this up, this has been a really very interesting talk, Stuart. I want to go back to your three. You, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. There was the third one, which is there's exceptions, and I want to. Here's my jam.
Go for it.
Omega-3 and vitamin D. Okay.
Check. Good. Yeah.
Okay.
So my supplement shelf is small. I live a lot further north than you do, so we get less useful sunshine. Definitely in the winter months, vitamin D is absolutely.
So my question to you, being a muscle expert, and me, I guess people would call me an enthusiast. I definitely try to follow the science, but there's widespread deficiency with vitamin D, no doubt.
Yes.
Across North America.
Absolutely.
So, and it is a steroid hormone that is doing similar things like testosterone in the sense where it's binding a receptor, going into the cell nucleus and regulating,
changing all kinds of genes. Yeah, absolutely.
Like 5% of the protein encoding human gene, a lot.
Absolutely.
So it's not just about bone homeostasis back to the RDA, but with omega-3, I do read a lot of the literature, and I certainly don't always get things right, but I've seen more than one. I've seen probably a handful of studies now looking at omega-3 supplementation and muscle mass. Specifically, I think there's older women, usually an older population, but it helping with, I think it may be helping prevent some of the atrophy or helping with lean muscle mass. Is that a real thing?
It's a real thing. Like in our hands, I had a postdoc, Chris McGlory. He left the lab. When he came, he has a faculty position now at Queen's University, but when he came, he was an omega-3 guy, and he said, we need to study more of this in human muscles. So we ran a trial, and we ran it actually in younger women. And then a bunch of people said, why do you only run it in women? I'm like, nobody ever asked you that, why you only ran it in men, right? So we did it in younger women for a number of reasons. There's not much research in younger women. And we did actually think that it might be more effective in women than men for reasons I don't fully understand. As you mentioned, older women there as well. We supplemented one group with very high dose omega-3 fatty acids, and we supplemented the other group with sort of a corn oil placebo. And then we braced one of their legs for our local disuse atrophy model for 2 weeks. And the women on the omega-3 supplement saw a really mild disuse atrophy response and then returned to normal much quicker than the other group who saw a much greater atrophic response and didn't get back to normal after 2 weeks of, we call it passive remobilization. You remove the brace, you don't actively rehab, you just like, go back, do all your normal things. So it's anti-catabolic for sure. That you can have a nutritional intervention that can affect disuse like that. That's a profound finding. So you can imagine, with respect to our disuse, catabolic crisis model, lots more work to be done. That's more Chris's area. He left. I'm like, that's yours, man. Go with it.
Is he still doing it?
He's still doing it.
I mean, here's the thing: is that we have this aging population, and it is much easier. As much as we want to get them to, first and foremost, can we get them to do any sort of resistance training?
Yes.
Obviously.
Yes.
But that is a struggle, especially for people that are much, much older.
Yep.
Getting them to take a pill.
Yes.
Is one of the easiest things that you can do. And
I would think.
Omega-3 is there. I think there's just been more and more evidence that there's many benefits, and I've talked about a lot of those. But the anti-inflammatory, resolving inflammation in so many different ways. I mean, there's like the specialized mediating, pro-mediating molecules. There's the resolvins, the protectins, the myrisins. I mean, it's doing. It isn't just prostaglandins. It's not just this one pathway. I mean, it's doing a lot of things. And what role does inflammation play? So inflammation, I know from reading your work, inflammation in a disease state like cancer or type 2 diabetes or things like this, I mean, it can be catabolic, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
What about the low-grade chronic inflammation, that unhealthy?
I think the disclaimer is, we've learned a lot about how to make muscle more anabolic in young individuals, and then we've extended that to healthy older individuals. We don't have older individuals participate in our study if they're on, and the list of medications is relatively long. So they're probably the healthiest of the older population, and so we're getting. We'd like to think that's a truer effect of aging rather than some meds that they're taking. But let me just say that chronic low-grade inflammation, or what people call inflammaging, is problematic. It's probably responsible for some of the anabolic resistance we talked about. We think so dampening the inflammation beforehand could help you get more anabolic. In extreme situations of, ICU or cancer, or, particularly cancer cachexia, where people are, they're swimming in inflammatory cytokines. And, COVID gave us a little glimpse of this cytokine storm that some people experience, and the prognosis becomes very poor. So we think a lot of things, nutritionally can combat muscle disuse, but if you have a patient that's on bed rest and in an ICU and they're, massively inflamed, you can throw a lot of things nutritionally at these people and it's just dust in the wind. Nothing really happens. So, the message is you've got to get inflammation under control before you're able to see the full and robust effect of a lot of the anabolic stimuli that we're talking about. So it is an issue, and it's clearly something that people need to think about as they get older. I'm actually of the mind that the low dose aspirin that a lot of people are taking to sort of tamp down inflammation is probably a good thing. But then also the flip side is to say there is some degree of inflammation that needs to happen. So if you keep chronically suppressing inflammatory responses in younger people even, I don't think you get a full adaptation. So some inflammation, good and necessary. Chronic low-grade inflammation, probably not good. Definitely rampant inflammation in all kinds of clinical states. Yeah, that's really going to take the edge off of anything that you do, both nutritionally and probably from an exercise perspective too.
Yeah, and what you said makes a lot of sense. With obviously you do want an inflammatory response when you need it, right? I mean, when you see a pathogen, and that is also why I think omega-3 is one of the best ways to kind of lower the chronic inflammation, because it has to do with resolving. In so many ways, the resolving of the inflammation.
It's almost as if you're turning down the burner, right? You're just sort of it's taking the edge off of that. So no, I agree.
Right. Yeah. And then my last supplement to ask you about, creatine monohydrate. Is that something, I mean, there's evidence that it seems to be beneficial for muscle growth, for brain health.
Yeah.
But is there side effects? Is there worry? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah. So again, short supplement shelf, that's on there for me. I don't take it all the time. I have periods where I'm doing a lot of work. I try and sort of ramp up the volume of work that I'm doing, and I will add creatine in at that time. Now I know I got friends who will say, "Why aren't you taking it all the time?" And I get it. Probably about 40 years old now. So as supplements go, it came and stayed, which makes it one of the number 3 categories. It sounds too good to be true. Its effects are pretty mild on muscle, but they're there. They're potent. They last. Now the brain and the cognitive side of things is the evidence is growing in that area too. If there were a danger with it, that it was there was a lot of talk about it's damaging your kidneys, it's doing this, you shouldn't, it's a guanidino compound, et cetera, et cetera. We've got 40 years worth of data with people on the supplement now, and we're not seeing some sort of rife wave of people who used it getting various forms of cancer, et cetera, which you would expect. 40 years is enough to see the effect. All the data reviewing it from a safety standpoint has given it 2 thumbs up. The adverse events are rare, usually in combination because people are taking not only that supplement but several others. So pinning it on creatine per se hasn't shown any credence. So it definitely gets an A grade from the effectiveness standpoint. I think it's good for younger and older people. I'm good with the health or the safety side of things as well. I do think people, if they're going to try it, should do it sort of gradually. It used to be you'd take these big loading doses, and I think most people now, a good friend of mine, Mark Tarnopolsky, neuromuscular physician, has all of his neuromuscular patients on it. So I think that's a fairly robust endorsement of what it can do for people with compromised muscle function. And he recommends that these people just start with a dose of about 4 to 5 grams of creatine a day.
What is he using it exactly for?
Well, I mean, all of these people have as one of their overriding symptoms, no matter what they have, whether it's a mitochondrial myopathy or some sort of dystrophy condition, is muscle weakness. So people do get a little bit of a boost. It may not be, something that you or I would consider worthy, but if you're somebody who's close to that line where, disability is here and ability is here, then creatine could be what it is that pushes you over that line. So he's, I think and again, you can go and read his papers. They're pretty robust studies done in all kinds of populations. And so, try it, see what you think. Most people tolerate it very well. You don't need a fancy brand of it. The stuff they sell at Costco or whatever is just as good as anything else. The monohydrate form is the one to aim for. Don't be fooled by creatine, insert your favorite derivative. Monohydrate is the one that's been most studied, and so probably the one you want to go for sure.
And it's good to know, so you don't actually have to be physically active to reap any benefits from it. And that was the question I had, because I mean, again, thinking of parents and grandparents right? I mean, that's the issue with the ones that are not physically active.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or that, I mean, there's people that walk their dogs and stuff, which is good. That at least gives them some physical activity. But you don't have to be pumping iron and stuff.
No, you don't.
Because I always thought about it that way. I'm like, well, I'm not like a gym rat, so do I need it? I mean...
Yeah, no, I mean, I think... The stuff now with creatine that they're uncovering that makes me think maybe this should be part of my regular routine actually has less to do with the muscle and more to do with the brain and the cognitive performance that it's come back several times now, improves. And, you mentioned I'm the director of PACE. It has a special place at my heart. And the truth is that you talk to people in PACE, our oldest participant is 104. So I consider him to be the icon of wisdom. And people talk about when they get older from a health standpoint, they want to be a burden. And that always, when you unpack it, is around, I don't want for somebody to have to take care of me because my physical capacity has gone down, or that my mental capacity has gone down. They all fear that. So it's dementia, and then it's physical inability to do things. And so I say, well, you're here working on the physical ability, but you're working on the dementia too. And they say, well, what else can I do? I said, well, here's a list of sort of things, and I'm by no means a dementia expert, but creatine might be something that older people might want to talk about for sure.
That's awesome. Really appreciate this conversation,
Yeah, my
Stuart.
pleasure.
And I look forward to continuing to follow your research. You're quite active on Twitter.
Yeah.
So can you tell people what your Twitter handle is?
Twitter handle?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm MacKinProf, MacKinProf. The same on Instagram. I'm much better on Twitter. I'm just much more comfortable with that rather than a picture of me doing something on Instagram. And I do have a Facebook page as well. It's smp.phd, and that's a professional page. You can find me on Facebook, and I'm on LinkedIn as well. So
awesome. Well, I follow you on Twitter, and there's you're tweeting useful things, so I encourage others to follow you as well. And again, thank you so much, Stuart.
My pleasure.
And,
my pleasure.
Look forward to chatting with you again sometime.
Yeah.